Professor Seidlar is an emeritus professor of social theory in the Department of Sociology in Goldsmiths University of London. He has written widely on philosophy, ethics, gender, and social theory, and his recent work includes Making Sense of Brexit, fascinating, Democracy, Europe, and Uncertain Futures and Ethical Humans, and Life, Love, Labour, Learning, and Loss. His most recent book is COVID-19 and Global Inequalities, Vulnerable Humans, on which this talk is based. And what can we expect from this evening? We can certainly expect from even speaking with Professor Seidlar this afternoon, a very thought-provoking discussion as he delves into our collective experiences from the 4 years post-COVID-19. He'll explore the ongoing struggle of remembering the trying times we've endured, including the profound losses suffered by children and students. We've all lived unique narratives during this difficult period, and with individuals worldwide grappling with grief and fighting for justice. Professor Seidlar will contextualize this pandemic era within broader social, historical, and economic perspectives, emphasizing the need to remember rather than erase our shared history. I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to open the mic for Professor Seidlar, or as he's happy to be known as, Vic. Good evening, Vic. Just need to unmute yourself. Thank you, Victor. Perfect. Hello.
Hi, it's lovely to be here, and it's lovely to see some familiar faces and friends who've joined, and that's always a joy, because it always makes such a difference to know who you're talking to. And it's been very good talking to Michael this afternoon, so we've started some kind of dialogue and some kind of conversation. I think that's been really helpful. So I was going to say something a little about my background in terms of the kind of work and research I've been doing over the last few years, and then say something about how I got into thinking about COVID or writing about COVID, and kind of recognizing that researching or writing about COVID is almost different from everything else, because we all carry our own personal stories and narratives. We all have our own personal experience of how we survived or lived through those traumatic years. And many of us have made choices either to basically forget that it ever happened, to think that it might have been some kind of bad dream, and somehow wanting to forget. So I want to focus my comments this evening on the relationship between forgetting and remembering, and why it might be important, particularly in relationship to COVID, to remember the times and experiences that we lived through. So just a little about the kind of research I do. I tend to kind of work in real time. I get excited by events or things that happen in the world that we don't really know how to understand, that challenge our kind of prevailing languages and narratives. So, for example, I started working around Diana's death as an event in London and then in the UK and then widely, where the traditional idea of it as a kind of a moment of deference towards the royals broke down, and people entered the streets, and the journalists had to hand over the microphones to the people themselves, because the way that the journalists wanted to understand what was happening was just completely unrealistic. It just didn't understand what was unfolding. So they handed the mics over, and a very different kind of language began to develop. So I was very interested in that as a kind of major event, to where we challenged a kind of culture of deference and renewed a sense of democratic citizenship in a way that's happened in Ireland, recently in terms of major referenda, where the very notions of Irish democracy have been reimagined in really kind of creative and important ways. And in the referendum about gay marriage or the referendum around abortion, there were really important openings. So I've tended to work around real time. When it came to COVID, I sensed that something was really happening. In January 2020, I already felt something was happening in the world, and that this was a major and important event. And I started writing about it. But I didn't think I would be so directly affected by it. I thought this was a major global event that needed to be understood and placed in kind of real context. But then, like with so many other people, my younger brother, got COVID, and then within 12 to 14 days died in Barnet Hospital. And I stopped writing. I didn't know how to think about what had happened. I realized the depth, not only in Britain, but around the world, of people having to deal with quite deep losses, which happened very suddenly, and where the traditional rituals of being able to be with someone in hospital or being able to be at a burial, these rituals, which are so important to us and often so taken for granted in different religious and secular traditions, suddenly were not available. I couldn't sit in the hospital next to my brother, and I couldn't be with him, even though I would have desperately wanted to do. And then I realized that this wasn't just a feature in my family, nor just in the wider community in London. This was happening not only all over the UK, it was happening globally. Part of our family is Brazilian, so I was experiencing the extraordinary cavalier disregard of President Bolsonaro in Brazil to really take seriously what was happening. And he had kind of followed the example of Trump in the States, which was to kind of underestimate the seriousness, and the research that had gone that was showing that we were entering a really difficult moment in all our lives. And in Brazil, particularly those people who lived outside the middle class in kind of areas on the periphery, there were very high levels of deaths. And it was kind of unbearable almost just to kind of witness. So I began to think about, why didn't I know about the dangers of pandemics? And then I realized that the histories that I had been taught, that we had been taught in school, were largely organized around the experience of war, either events that lead to war or events that followed during the war. And that my sense of historical awareness and historical consciousness was so organized in this way that I had no real understanding of the Spanish flu around the First World War and the overwhelming number of people who died during the Spanish flu. It was either treated as a speciality, as something to do with the history of medicine or something, or illness. But it wasn't in my curriculum of the kind of history that I knew that would have given me the chance to understand the seriousness of what was unfolding. And that was true generally, whatever kind of education you had in Britain, that it was treated as a kind of marginal on the periphery. But suddenly this wasn't on the periphery, it was reorganizing our sense of historical consciousness and awareness, and realizing that we needed to write history in a different way to give space to the importance of pandemics, not only because they'd happened before, but also because they're likely to happen and will happen in the near future. That what's happened in COVID is not the end of a story, but is actually a warning sign of, given the changes in technology and also the speed, so that when people saw, and I saw, the vaccine, the COVID developing in China, and you thought, well, this was happening in China, but then because of the shifts in technology and major transport shifts, it was a matter of hours before you could trace the COVID across the world and across Europe. And I was particularly struck by the events that were happening in Italy. I was kind of reading about Italy quite intensively and trying to make sense of just how overwhelmed, how quickly their health service was. And this was in some way a really good health service, but it couldn't deal with, didn't understand the coronavirus and what it meant in terms of the threats that it posed to public health. But even while it was happening in Italy, it was very slow in Britain. Britain, in its kind of imperial arrogance shown by Johnson and the kind of masculine public school ethos, thought we would be safe. It wouldn't really happen here, and the NHS would be very clearly protected and together. But that was nonsense. And it did come to Britain, and it came to Britain very forcefully and has had enormous impacts and effects. But and the book COVID-19 and Global Inequalities traces that development right the way through, and it tries to put the pandemic in the historical context of earlier pandemics in Britain, of the plague, and the awareness of how certain people could easily move out of urban areas. They could move to the countryside, they could move out of London, and they could take refuge in points of safety. So initially with COVID, it was said, we're all in the same boat. COVID doesn't discriminate. But actually, we weren't in the same boat, and COVID very clearly did discriminate. And we realized through the first months, for example, that the number of NHS doctors who died were from ethnic minority backgrounds. And we suddenly began to realize how the distribution of COVID in the UK, but not only in the UK, was bringing to the surface levels of racial inequality and racial injustice and class inequalities that a neoliberal cultural framework had wanted to ignore or avoid, didn't want to face what had happened, or didn't really want to learn the lessons. And I can imagine we can all remember a certain kind of determination, which is what I want to focus on, that we would learn the lessons and we would build back differently. Do you remember the phrase, build back differently? That was there and around. So the focus I want to make, because I don't want to overgeneralize, people can read the book and it's available, and there's a reduction on the book that will be available to everyone here. I wanted to focus on a particular concern that's emerged for me, which is, why is it that so many people want to forget COVID and want to say that we're somehow returning to normal, or we are in normal? And I want to think about, with everyone here, just think together about the tension between being able to build back differently and learn the lessons, and the conflict that exists with a determination to forget, to put it aside, and to return to normal. 2 weeks ago, I went to a wonderful party in Denmark with some friends, and I started talking to people about their experience of COVID. And it was very striking to me in Denmark, which has a very different cultural framing where people are much more identified with the authority structures in their own country. There was a very clear sense, almost of everyone I talked to, that we'd returned to normal and we could forget those days. So I was struck by how quickly people felt the need to forget, and that it was only in conversations with people that you began to realize, you began to dig deeper in the conversation, and you realized that things were much more complicated. People began to share how some people they knew had symptoms of long COVID, and that long COVID was a reality. People began to share knowing friends who had lost their sense of taste or lost their sense of smell, which was a symptom of COVID in a particular kind of way. And people began, if you talk to them, to remember just how hard it was for them in school. That the isolation and the loneliness of suddenly going into a new school, but never having been able to go to the school because all your teaching was online. And the real impact of that, of those years, that was somehow being carried, but not being recognized or acknowledged. They were carried in our bodies, all these histories that we have, but we haven't really wanted to engage or think about them very seriously. So I was very struck how on that trip to Denmark, it was that the return to normal had meant that we could forget. We could almost forget that this thing had ever happened. And there were then real difficulties about how could you learn the lessons if you were so determined to forget? And what lessons are we going to be able to learn? So just thinking about this in more detail, it's often the people who had suffered losses, like the bereaved families for COVID, for justice, who have forced the public inquiry in Britain and questioned politicians and medical advisors about what happened during the COVID time. They are people who really can't forget because they're dealing with losses in their own families and in their own communities. They can't forget. But generally, within the wider culture, people felt a need to forget and didn't want to be reminded. So there were incidents on the London Tube where if people were wearing masks, even as a process of self-protection, they might be attacked or challenged because they reminded people of difficult moments in their own lives that they were so determined to forget. The French philosopher Simone Weil, one of the things she says is how if you make or encourage people to make connections that they don't want to make, then often they will respond to you with hostility and violence. They don't want to be reminded, and the mask at a certain stage in London was a reminder. So there were incidents in the London Underground where people were wearing masks for their own safety and also to protect others. But it was very clear that people in their determination to forget, didn't want to remember at all. So the contradiction, or the thing that I'm kind of trying to think out, is this tension between needing to remember in order to be able to learn the lessons, and the determination to forget that means that we can't learn any of the lessons. And this difference has quite profound implications, because if we pretend that things have just returned to normal, we can't understand the high levels of mental illness, adolescent mental illness, that have developed in the last few years and the increase. But we also can't really support the many young people in British schools who are no longer going to school. The numbers of people who are not going to school, not going, or feeling so anxious in a kind of public setting, shows you how, in an embodied way, people are still living through the traumas of that time and that experience, but finding it hard to get the support that they need to recognize that the anxieties that are then producing high levels of adolescent mental illness and showing themselves in the in high levels of school refusal. So the implications of COVID are still with us in quite profound and important ways. And we need to be able to think about them in ways that allow us to learn some of the lessons. So it's interesting talking into Ireland in this way, into Ireland, because at some level, and this was in conversation with Michael earlier, the troubles and the traumatic experiences, which were very different and long-standing, but still are there echoing and realities that people are still having to find ways of dealing with. But how do we find, what's the process through which we find our ways of dealing with it? And what has come out in the public inquiry is a kind of masculine public school ethos, particularly in Britain and represented by Johnson in some ways, of a kind of refusal to engage emotionally with loss or whatever people are going through. So there were no statewide, until very, very late, recognitions of public mourning. In the time of Diana, people came onto the streets in complicated ways because they wanted to mourn together in public. This wasn't possible in the time of COVID. But in the time of COVID, there was no state recognition of really what was going on. There was a kind of ignoring and a refusal to find the words that were needed to help people recognize what it meant to not have the rituals that could have helped them, not being able to be with, or not be able to attend funerals, and therefore not having traditional ways of expressing their grief or being able to somehow come to terms with their own losses. This was happening not just, and these were either seen in familial terms, but in some way these are social and cultural, large scale experiences of loss, which a society needs to be able to really frame, acknowledge, recognize, support people through. So what was clear and what I explored in the book is also the levels of class and social inequality that became visible, that there was a way that a neoliberal society where people were focusing on individual achievements and individual success, and where people had lost a relationship with neighborhood and community, suddenly one of the positive things that was happening through COVID was a recognition of people's responsibilities to neighbours and to community. People were prepared to put themselves out for others and recognise community in a different way. Also, people stopped in their lives because of the lockdown. And this could be dangerous. There will increase, again, I trace levels of domestic violence, sexual violence, and domestic violence, because people were suddenly in spaces that they couldn't escape from. They couldn't leave the city, they couldn't even leave their apartment or their flat. And levels of COVID were higher in working class communities with with poor housing conditions, which were shared across many generations. So space, people couldn't leave the space, even where that space was potentially violent. They were obliged to somehow stay in contexts that they would have been able to move away from. So there were implications of violence, of domestic and sexual violence. And there were also feelings of isolation and aloneness, which we're still within. So there's a kind of recognition of just the numbers of people in London who live on their own. It's like 50% or 60% now of people who are making their own families as individuals in their own spaces. But there are also real issues around loneliness and isolation that have become visible. So there are lots of issues, social issues, cultural issues, that have become visible in the context of COVID, that if we want to forget COVID, we're not going to learn or really be able to think about in any kind of realistic or helpful way. And then there are the longer term educational implications, where recent research in London has showed there's a whole generation of people who have lost the capacities or skills that they might otherwise have developed, and that even by the 2030s, the results that are expected in London schools are much lower than they would have been before. So there's a kind of recognition that for particular age cohorts, there are long-term implications which really need to be directed. There are also the high rise in mental illness that again needs to be not just seen in individualistic terms, but is understood in the context of the social and traumatic experience of COVID. So wanting to remember also means reframing our understanding of ourselves as ethical humans. Because a liberal moral culture, which goes across religious and secular and humanistic tradition, tends to encourage us to put the past behind us. So you can be a Christian, a Muslim, or a humanist, or within the terms of a liberal moral culture, our relationship to the past is one of active forgetting. We tend to think that there's no point in dwelling on the past because we can't change it. There's no point on dwelling on negative feelings of sadness or loss in the past because we can't change them. So our sense of our identities as ethical humans is very much based on living in the present and planning for the future. So we're not used to, in most of our religious and secular traditions, of recognizing the value of memory or the importance of memory. I think that's one of the strengths of Hebraic tradition, that recognizes the importance of memory. that in memory comes a certain possibility of speaking more truthfully or more openly through remembering the experiences that we've lived through. So if we were together in a group, if say we shaped this slightly differently and we were sharing our experiences of what we'd lived through those times, and we had a chance of sharing the difficult feelings that we had lived through, rather than simply putting them aside and forgetting them, not only would we have a recognition of ourselves as emotional humans and spiritual humans, but we would have a sense of how memory matters. How rather than putting something aside and thinking the troubles were a feature of the past, we recognize, no, these difficult experiences are carried in bodies, not just in minds. And bodies can be made sick and ill because they've not faced the emotional histories and times that they have lived through. So, what's at stake in understanding or engaging with COVID is a different sense of ourselves as ethical humans who are in relationship, as humanist traditions rightly acknowledge, in relationship with other human beings. And we make our lives not simply as individuals, but through our relationships with others. That we learn to think, we learn to feel, we learn to identify through the relationships we have with others, which is why they're so striking and so important. And it might be that the isolation that people were forced into at a time of COVID opens a possibility of a different, wider understanding of ourselves as ethical humans in relationship with others. And a sense that now might be the time, 4 years later, when journalists, newspapers have to return to these traumatic times of COVID to open up possibilities of conversations that have been closed down. And therefore giving thanks to this possibility this evening in the Irish Humanist Association to exactly open up this kind of conversation between us all, and people raise questions, not only about what I've said, but also about the questions that you've been carrying in your own relationships to COVID, and how we all have in some way benefited through our altered relationships to nature, which somehow came through. We could hear the birds, we could see the trees, we could imagine in the time of COVID that there were potential positives. It wasn't complete negative, but it's important to find the balance between both those positive things and hold on to them, and also just recognizing how life post-COVID, both education we've talked about, how work has been absolutely radically transformed because of people working from home in technologies, and how community is completely transformed by us being able to meet together in Ireland with people from all over the place, coming from because of that technology. But it's still not the same as being in the same room, but it's a really good beginning. And it's good that we can open up this conversation. And I think I've said enough.
Thank you, Vic. One observation made before I open to the audience, and brilliant insight to your own observations. But if I say Partygate, if I say, Downing Street and Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, if I mention Michelle O'Neill, who only yesterday and this week has come out and apologized for attending the funeral of a IRA volunteer, Bobby Story. And what this points to as a question is, how let down were people by those in government or in leadership roles who are supposed to be the good examples in a basic sense, from a societal perspective. How much did that impact people's trust? Because we talked earlier about COVID fatigue, but and then PTSD, like negative moods, hypervigilant thoughts, intrusive thoughts, hyper anger. How much of that came to the fore for people in being so let down by those that are supposed to lead by example?
I think that's a really, really good question. And it's something that the book deals with, because it talks about the gender politics of the kind of public school masculinities that were there in Downing Street, and the disdain for legislation that they themselves passed but felt somehow were not responsible to. So one of the interesting things that came out in the COVID inquiry was interviews showing just how sexist and how women, even in the cabinet office with very senior positions, were not listened to or addressed. That was important. But the key thing I think is really significant is trust. When trust breaks, it's very difficult to repair. And there's a way that there's a wonderful Danish philosopher called Løstrup, who talks about how we start in our relationships with others through trusting them. And that trust is almost like the most basic aspect in our relationships. But once that's broken, it's very hard to repair. And it brings a really interesting contrast, because in Denmark, where they did relatively well in terms of the mappings of different countries, there is much stronger trust for government authority. There's a very different kind of cultural, and some people on this Zoom know more about Denmark than I do. But it's very striking, their trust in their government and in the policies. And they felt, and they were addressed in different ways by their leadership. This was very clear also in New Zealand and in different countries where women leaders did much better, at least initially, in terms of COVID.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Jacinda Ardern, and how New Zealand managed it and kept that.
And what's interesting is the way she managed it was with a different kind of authority. It wasn't the kind of public school authority. It was a kind of authority where she was part of the community. It was a different kind of egalitarian democracy that she was trying to live out in this moment of crisis. Something similar happened, I think, with a Danish PM who's a woman at that time. So I think initially those that did better were those where the trust was maintained. I think what was hard in Britain, and you saw that in the kind of arrogance and public school mentality and masculinities that were on show in Britain, that the gender politics was a real part of how we need to rethink what happened in the COVID times. And people lost trust, and once the Partygate happened, it's been very hard to rebuild it. it's almost like we're still in England, at least in different ways, we're still on the edge of why people have stopped listening to many politics. They just, once you stop listening, it's very hard for politicians to then kind of regain attention or regain trust. But I think how you rebuild trust, or what trust means in a democratic society, or what your experience in Ireland has been around a different politics of trust, where in Ireland people have had to go back in the Magdalene laundries, to think or reflect about painful histories in the past in order to build trust in the present. So it might be that there is a relationship that you're helping me think about the need for memory or remembering in order to be able to trust in the present. That unless that work, that inner emotional, psychic work is done, it's very hard to rebuild trust in a community. And I think what happened in parts of London, where people reached out, gave food to their neighbours and were knocking on the doors of neighbours, was a kind of local ecology of trust, which is important to value and recognise, but can easily get lost when we're thinking about returning to normal. Because returning to normal is returning to a kind of aggressive neoliberal individualism where people don't even know who's living next door to them in the city.
Yeah. Well, also that maybe speaks to, innate survival mode, fight or flight, for many people, to find ways to have connectivity. I mentioned sea swimming, and the increase in interest in small tribes forming, were permissible, and within, say, in Ireland, you had a 5 kilometer radius, and if people could go to a sea swimming area and they felt comfortable, it was taken up with aplomb, because people needed some small connectivity.
That might be how trust is. In order to rebuild trust, you have to rebuild it from the bottom up. You have to build it in your friendships and in your relationships. And you need to imagine community in a very different kind of way, where it's in the local that trust gets.
Amusingly, in Townley, people said a lot of these small sea swim groups were collectively women, because they'd had enough of the male opposite in that nucleus that they called home during that period. But I see a hand raised, and I will go to our first question. Hugh, good evening. I see you there, and please unmute and say hello.
Good evening, Michael. Good evening, Vic.
Hi, Hugh.
Victor, I'm sorry to hear about your brother, and my condolences. Yeah, I think it was a terrible time, but I live in the country in Ireland, so I survived it fairly well, even going up to the local shop every day to get my newspapers and back again without considering, and keeping well away from people and keeping masks on and so on. But one of the problems that you mentioned referenda and cohesive societies and how they vote in these referenda. We had 2 recent referenda on the Constitution in Ireland, the Family Amendment and the Care Amendment, and both of them were rejected by the electorate. And one of the problems during COVID was that the government rushed to pay people who became unemployed, or to pay companies to support them in getting over this situation, and so on. But they didn't care about the people who are then unemployed and who are on welfare and so on. So our welfare system is a system that we have to it has to be means tested. So one of the things that I support is a universal basic income for everyone, to enable people to make their own decisions and make societal decisions. Because part of the problem we had with COVID was that we had a lot of big egos going around, as you had in the UK. And they were the ones that were going to solve the problem of COVID. But they forgot about people like your brother and other people, and they allowed this situation to happen. So I believe that we need to enable societies, we need to enable people to think for themselves and to value themselves. So two of the things I think should need to happen is that government must target policies for the citizens and not for anyone else, initially for the citizens. So all policies must be targeted at the citizens to ensure we have a cohesive society and ensure they have enough to live on. And secondly, that universally basic income should be implemented. So with that in mind, I'd like you to address the sort of inequality that we have, because COVID, as you know, has created greater inequality than ever before.
Hugh, that's really,
Thank you, Hugh. Yeah.
Hugh, that's really important, because it's very clear that there's been increased inequality since COVID. So if you look at schools in London, the levels of poverty in London, which means that school children who are exposed to outside the school gate, makes it extremely difficult to know what's, to build back or to really deal with the effects of COVID. What I try to do is look at, in the book, I look at the kind of inequalities that were shown and revealed, and particularly health inequalities as well. And the research, I review the research on health inequalities. And what emerges, and also a certain sense of despair, that there are certain conditions, particularly in the Northeast, but not only, of a kind of despair as a result of the closing of major industries over time. So what you're saying, which I agree with, which is the possibility of a basic income, it could be the way in which you restore democracy in a particular kind of way, because you ensure that people can't be forgotten, or that people as citizens are valued through the basic income which they have. I think that's a really important possibility. I don't know whether you saw, I saw the National Theatre play on Nye Bevan, and it's still going on in my head. There's a kind of wonderful scene in that around the beginnings of a library. Just the idea of a library where you could go in and take a book. And if you went into a bookshop and you took a book and you walked out, they'd call the police, right? But if you went into a library, and this was a kind of revelation in 47, 1947 or whatever, you could actually take the book out and then bring it back in 2 weeks' time. And there was a radical shift of a principle that was there in the National Health Service. That was a principle of need that has been absolutely vital in sustaining not only socialist traditions in Britain, but much more general, a sense of kind of human dignity, where health is not seen as something that is related to income, but related to need. And the basic income might well be the way that that can be leveraged back in. And it might be that's why it's important to reflect back on COVID, because of those people who were not supported. And it was only particular groups that were financed by the Tories, and other groups, even, and for a long time, people who were working on their own didn't get compensation, didn't get money. And that's important to remember. That's another example of why remembering in detail the policies that were carried out, and also I think why the COVID inquiry in Britain, and I'm not sure what kind of inquiry you're having in Ireland, has raised those quite fundamental questions. And what's interesting, when I went to the COVID inquiry, and the book was submitted as evidence to the COVID inquiry, was that it was those bereaved parents and family people who couldn't forget, who were taking the most direct action in terms of in organizing the inquiry and making sure that the right questions were being asked. And I think it's a really good model. I think that inquiry and also the Post Office inquiry are really significant lessons to learn from.
Rick, your hand is raised. You have the floor. Please go ahead. Thank you, Vic. Thank you, Hugh, for your question. I'll help you unmute. Bear with me. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good. The first thing to say is that being at a Zoom meeting is very evocative of the pandemic. I haven't been on a Zoom meeting for months, and it was very much part of the pandemic, so that's very evocative. But the point I wanted to raise is that the people who are most significant, the government, are the ones that are most actively forgetting. And from my reading, planning that has taken place since then has been negligible, planning for future pandemics. And there's a lot of concern amongst some medical people and epidemiologists and others about the lack of planning, and that in some ways at this point in time, we are less ready for another pandemic than we were back then in 2020, which is saying something. So in terms of protective equipment or the ability to develop another vaccine. So this is an aspect of the politics really that we need to look at, is that active, because my fear is that the inquiry is a diversion. It's a sort of emotional safety valve, but it's very slow, and the active planning and preparation is not happening, and people are not, especially people in positions of power in the government. I mean, this particular government has been shambolic in all sorts of ways and has been undermining the health service for 14 years.
Rick, if I may add to that, just as a comment,
yes.
What was your thoughts around the health leaders versus the government leaders during the pandemic? What was your feeling of how that developed?
Well, there were obviously some very good things happened, for example, in the vaccine development, and that went well. But in a lot of aspects, I think the medical voices were co-opted for the purposes of the political leaders, and a lot of information that should have been made public was not made public. That's my personal view, is that, you know, what was going on in the care homes and so on was minimized, and they were very evasive about all that. And I'm afraid that some of the medical leadership, what should I say, were rather deferential under the circumstances. Yeah.
The medical leadership didn't speak out very strongly in terms of what was going to obviously happen in the care homes, and they must have known. So I think Rick's absolutely right that they were silenced, or they were brought in to kind of support the story. There was something that the medics, and this goes very deep though, this goes very deep, which is the idea that the medics provide the science and that the science is neutral, but it's not to do with the political values, and that it's for the politicians to make the decisions.
Yes.
I think one of the, which I haven't worked on, is the way that the medical science sees itself as like producing the facts, but not engaging in a direct way with the political judgments. And I think that goes very deep into the very notion of kind of scientific knowledge, that scientific knowledge is neutral to be used, and it's for the politicians. So there's something in our scientific methodology, without being too flabby, that feeds into the way that the medical people could be co-opted. I haven't thought about this before, but I think, Rick, you're absolutely right in terms of how that's done. And what the government has done is actually undercut and destroy some of the infrastructure that you would need in a new pandemic in terms of the medical infrastructure in the country in order to produce vaccines. So it's full-blown that they've gone backwards and destroyed the possibility of being better organized for a future pandemic, and they don't want to talk about it. Well, I think it's true that the inquiry was something that they didn't want to happen, and eventually they had to give in to having the inquiry. But I think that the inquiry has a certain momentum on its own that means it isn't just an emotional kind of release. And so I think the inquiry potentially is a place where the lack of preparedness for the future, the destruction of the infrastructure, could be a major consideration. And it's being very well reported in Britain, you know, that every day or something when the inquiry is happening. The thing is, they're trying to slow down the inquiry, and they don't want the inquiry because potentially it is being effective, which is why they're kind of slowing down. And certainly the forms of inquiry that are also supposed to look into the effectiveness of the vaccines and the research that went into the vaccines, and also some of the medical conditions that have been produced through the vaccines, the dangers of some of the vaccines, are also things that are on the agenda for the inquiry. Whether they'll reach it or not, I don't know. But I think something about the relationship of the medics to the politicians is on the agenda. And I think some of the questions of the politicians in the inquiry was very impressive. And the politicians were really forced, you know, and didn't want to, I thought were really, you could show the kind of lack of trust. Whether we're going to have another government will be any different, who knows? But one fears that the politics around the pandemic isn't central enough to the considerations, and a lot of newspapers are not reporting it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And to Rick's point, the leadership in the medical space were stymied and curtailed, for the sake of governments, and their type of direction with it. I see Judith, and there's two ladies there, so please say hello, and you're both welcome to speak up and say hi.
Yeah. Unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. No, Vic, I'd like to say thank you. I think you've given us a very rounded and informative and thoughtful talk. And I think a lot of the things you say could, we could talk about for a very long time. Oh, somebody's gone off. Anyway, and this whole sort of leitmotif of forgetting and remembering is absolutely essential. And, when you talked about the model in laundries and the importance of remembering and being able to kind of allow people to, express their feelings and feel that they were listened to and get some level of reparation for the pain and the huge life changes that they'd suffered. But I think, we need to look at the science. I mean, there are so many strands in this, and as you said, the scientific methodology. And I think, like a lot of people say, we need debate, and there was not debate at the time. And, there was a lot of very, very eminent people throughout the world were disagreeing with, governmental direction. And it seems that the governments, in many cases, in many countries, were what's the word? Their response seemed to be led by pharmaceutical companies, and that's something we haven't talked about. And there was a lot of coercion and support for people around vaccines, and I think there were, that was an important move for many, many people. But I think it didn't allow people to make their own decisions, have open debate. And even now, a lot of people, talk in couched terms about the way they feel about the past. And I know that there were a lot of divisions in families over people who wanted to have vaccinations, people who didn't want to have vaccinations. A huge amount of pain went on. And I think, as you say, a lot of medics, were ruled by the pharmaceutical companies. And, you look at these inquiries, and the recent one in England, the post office scandal, has taken 20 years to come out. There are people of my age, I know people whose mothers took thalidomide, and they haven't still got any reparation. There's the blood scandal, that is still ongoing 30, 40 years later. And people are still suffering, and there seems to be a deafening silence here in Ireland. I know things are percolating up in England in terms of media and stuff, but it's very slow. And, there are very, very thoughtful medical people, top of their tree, Nobel scientists and so on, who lost jobs, who were, hushed and silenced and censored. And, when you get those kind of draconian responses, it makes you really wonder what's going on, makes you very suspicious. And again, I think it's going to take a lot of time to rebuild trust. And there are certain areas that I think perhaps trust will never be regained. Until there really is an open debate. And yeah, I've so enjoyed listening to you and all the things you've said. It's very stimulating, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure a lot of people who are here, we could probably, have 3 or 4 hours discussing, the general and the personal. But the power of the pharmaceutical companies, how they pay for research, how they pay for medical training, you know, should be scrutinized. I don't know what you think about that, Vic. I'd be interested to hear. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful, Judith. I think it should. I think all those things should be scrutinized. But certainly, what you're raising about big pharma, I talked to Michael about, who does know something about this. But what was interesting was two things. Firstly, that the inequalities between different countries, that who had the patents. And there was a move at the beginning, supported by the UN, that the patents should be opened up and different countries should be able to produce their own versions, having the result of the science. Then there were other major figures, benefactory figures, who refused that, who said that that would undermine the profit motive and you wouldn't get that level of research. I think that's a shame. And that's discussed in the book quite specifically in terms of people who were trying to open up in desperate situations. And then the other thing that that's there is what countries were given priority in buying up the vaccines. It wasn't just the vaccine was available and available universally. The people who paid the prices, the high prices for the vaccines, were Western European, the States, the North, basically, global North, who were able to appropriate large proportions and pay for the vaccines that other countries in the global South couldn't, which is why the book is trying to look at it kind of globally and see, these are global inequalities that are reflected in racial inequalities within the nation state. But it's really important to try and understand the role of big pharma. And then what's really striking, but just a question mark, is that AstraZeneca, which Rick mentioned as the research and was relatively successful, they said that they would produce the vaccine at a non-profit base. There were issues with that vaccine, but that vaccine was very kind of almost shamed in the background and withdrawn. And so none of the other manufacturers were prepared to produce it at a kind of non-profit basis. So if you look at the experience, say in India, and the spread and the unavailability of supplies of oxygen and the chaos, basically, and then the caste and class divisions in terms of who's died. So when people want to forget, it's those people who can afford to forget and who don't want to be reminded and they don't want to know what happened. That's why they want to forget, because they don't want to be reminded of the levels of deaths in different areas in the country and how it's racially and class divided and who died and who was able, basically, as you say in Ireland, you're able to do, move to the countryside, like you said, move to the countryside, relatively safe, go and get your newspaper every day. You weren't endangered. But if you lived in areas of Leicester, which was very highly Indian migrant populations living in cross-generational houses, the spread of the virus couldn't be dealt with. And that, Leicester was locked down on 2 or 3 separate occasions. But then when you're locking down, you're locking people into the same situation that they're in. They can't escape. They're still in those multi-story, multi-family houses, and people are getting, and the illness is moving up and down the kind of family chain. So what's a scandal is the way that even now, 4 years later, if you talk to most newspapers, they'll say, no, people aren't interested in COVID. They don't really want to be reminded. They don't want to be talked about. So anybody who could help in distribution and getting people to know about the book would be really helpful, because the book is trying to create a counter narrative that forces the newspapers on to say, no, we haven't been able to build back in the way that we were, but we need now to stop and reflect and realize how the high levels, when people talk about it, of kind of adolescent mental health, these go back to COVID. It's not just a separate incident. It's something which emerges out of a social context. And now it's just being treated as completely separate, or questions of sexual violence, completely separate, not actually being connected back to the experience and history of COVID, as if it almost had, as like I said, it's almost as if it's a bad dream that we don't want to be reminded of. So I think all the points that you brought up are really, really important to engage and stay with.
And you know, just on the pharmaceutical piece, Vic, and I know we talked about it earlier for Judith, even in the pharmaceutical industry itself, the sense of COVID fatigue is quite you know, potent. Like, people have become so you know, anti, for example, decentralized trials. COVID brought trials to homes, to people's homes, because people couldn't be in centralized investigational centers, and with decentralized trials brought additional costs in a sense of looking at GDPR. So now the model is going back to centralized trials, which is a cheaper model, because people, you know, the pharmaceutical groups, you know, in a sense, lost a lot of their pipelines and forecasts, and are now looking at more specialty drug because they're more valuable, i.e. to market, to sell. So there's a lot happening, and you know, I was quite linked to some of the trials, and it was I said to Vic, it was, you know, I was flabbergasted how quickly trials happened, but then I was also flabbergasted at how moving dosages of vials and vaccines to low-income countries wasn't at the same level, because there was a security element to it, and the preciousness of the materials couldn't be met. So you know, in essence, 30% of the globe did not get vaccinated. 70% roughly globally did get vaccinated, and 30% speaks to effectively low-income countries who are still without first phase vaccination. So it is quite telling, and again, it's not something that is really publicized. Patrick, sorry, do you want to come back in, Judith? I see, and then I'll go to Patrick. Beg your pardon.
My sister is actually staying with me, and she knows Vic, and I think she has a question for him.
Two things I'd like to say to start with, Vic. I did know that your brother had died during COVID, and I just want to say again that I'm really sorry that happened. And I want to thank you for all you've said. It's been very thought-provoking and helpful. And there's two things I'd like to say for myself. One is around the issue of trust. I mean, all my life I've been very suspicious or very cautious about conventional medicine. My initial thought with the vaccine was very, I live in France, actually. I was sort of holding back and not trusting and wanting to wait, although I was really very aware of the seriousness of the first wave of COVID. And I have friends in Denmark like you, and I was very affected by the trust, the high level of trust that the Danish friends I had, who would say to me things like that. Like, we absolutely trust our government. When I was talking about my feelings about the vaccination initially, they were saying, no, we trust the government. The government wouldn't tell us to do anything that was not, you know, absolutely perfect. And then I did eventually have the vaccine myself because I wanted to travel. And then I was still questioning. And then my son and his family were living in New York. And I think what really upset me, and I still feel that, is that the FDA approved of vaccines for very young children, from babies for 6 months old upwards. And I felt that that was just a financial thing, an economic thing, because Europe had refused that for young children and stopped wanting to vaccinate children. The other thing I want to say that I've noticed, you say, who's preparing for the next pandemic? well, I heard Bill Gates talking about it. I've heard the World Health Organization. I've received quite a lot of emails or texts and things from people who, and I've looked at different things that are showing that the World Health Organization is trying to push through binding statutes or laws, I don't quite know what to call it, to make a new, it's called a new pandemic treaty that would give the World Health Organization more power than individual countries to sort of impose things on individual countries. And I think maybe not enough people are aware of what the World Health Organization is trying to do at the moment. And I think it's really well worth looking at that, so that they can't just push it through without people realizing what's happening. I think that's all I want to say. Thanks.
Yeah, that's lovely to hear, Marie. I think that it's interesting what the difference of trust between Denmark, say, you were feeling, and then how to evaluate or think about that now. You know,
Yes.
were they wrong to be trusting, or what's the who do we trust? You know what I mean? Who can we trust, given the influence and power of big pharma in this, and the role of what you said about markets? You know, what Michael said about markets really needs to be questioned, because what if we're in, or you're working in a situation where it's the young children are given in New York under 6 months.
No, under, I think it was from 6 months to, I can't remember the exact age.
It was 6 months above or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, my grandson was not able to go to playgroup unless he had the vaccine. And I pleaded with my son to wait because they were going to come back to Europe. But they just couldn't not let him go to the playgroup because they needed him to do that. So he was vaccinated, whereas European children and Danish children were not being vaccinated. Wow. They weren't, Jude. They weren't.
No, they weren't. They didn't, and there were some pressures, but it was forced back. But that shows you like the strength of the market, doesn't it? Of market forces. So
I mean, the words that Pfizer used were quite creepy, and you know, something like parents are so happy to welcome this possibility of vaccinate. I mean, it was so awful what they. But I'll stop now and let you answer.
No, I think that's absolutely right, because it's like, how do we make with, you know, what's big pharma's role in this? In terms of increase, and if their role is always in increasing the market, and they're saying something like parents are really welcoming and want this, there's something about market power,
very much so,
that ethically needs to be fundamentally challenged. What gives pharma that right, and then what is the authority with which that research is then being done or not shared? You know, what Michael said, 30% of the world isn't getting it, still hasn't got it. So, and then, you know, what's our understanding? In some way, because of what Rick said about the relationships between the politicians and the medical authorities, how linked they were together, there's been relatively little real critical engagement with big pharma in terms of the moral positions it took and the responsibilities that it actually has. I think that's it's scary. It is scary because, you know, if you talk to people, one of the things I was puzzled by was the number of people who worked in the NHS, who were nurses and who were doctors, who refused to take the
vaccine.
Quite a long time, and they were threatened with if they didn't take it by a certain date, they would lose their jobs. And it went right away to the edge. Actually, that would be really interesting to kind of study a bit more. It went to the edge, and then the government conceded because so many people would have left. And then you think, well, what is it that they knew that we didn't know? Because we were being told it was absolutely fine. and hunky-dory. And then they were resisting. And you thought, well, they were resisting because they knew something, or there was something going on that was not being spoken about. And the World Health Organization, as you say, which really needs to be challenged, is kind of doing that on a macro scale, where people will be obliged to take the vaccine in individual countries, whether they're so, rather than take on the WHO, which has its own global interest, rather than taking on the moral issues of saying, how can we ensure next time, like what Michael said, 100% of the get the vaccine? Why isn't that the issue, rather than somehow forcing people in countries to take the vaccine? So it's a kind of the role of the WHO and the interests of different national groups, China and the US in the WHO, and who has what power to say, are really important. But I skirt this. I do some of it in the book, but I don't take on big pharma in that kind of way. Though it's interesting that Gates was one of the people who stood up and said that the licenses shouldn't be released so that people could produce their own vaccines. And I don't know whether he's been challenged on that, but that is something that he should be challenged on. So it's like, what's the priority? And is the priority, and what are we learning? And if we're not prepared to remember, we're not going to learn anything.
Yeah, and then if you throw into the pot the conspiracy of it being a bioweapon, in its formulation, right? That was conspired to be designed to cause the havoc that it created as a form of bioweaponry, which is is out there and in discussion forums everywhere.
What do you
Patrick,
mean by weapon? Could you say a bit more about that?
Well, I mean that there's the conspiracy that it was created effectively out of a laboratory in China as a weapon to bring to the world, so by creating it and it transferring itself across the globe, what was there something sinister at play, in the sense that once it was brought out to the rest of the world, how was it that China seemed to have it fairly under control about a year later? And that a lot of it seemed to have been locked down, whereas we were feeling the effects. So that's out there, as part of it, right? The fallout of, again, that societal trust piece, in terms of, did China have something to do with this being not just a pandemic, but something more sinister was at play? Patrick, I see you've been patiently waiting to comment and say hi.
Not terribly
Please
sure.
do.
It's been worth waiting to hear what I have to say. It's very little, actually. And Vic, thank you for such an interesting topic and bringing it before our little organization. But I'd love if we could finish up on a little bit of something positive out of all of this. And I mean, I do hope we've learned something. You've got the inquiry in Britain. You've got now the Northern Ireland one, which is ongoing. And we now will have our inquiry coming up very soon, which I do hope will be less of people mea culpaing and blaming everybody else, that we will come away with something positive in that. But I do think we've learned a little bit about being prepared for health emergencies. I'd like to think that. Maybe I'm being optimistic. And also, I got a sense that there was a certain amount of global cooperation which you wouldn't have gotten for anything else, considering the trouble that the world is in at the moment in terms of wars and everything else. And because it was one thing about a pandemic like that, it doesn't recognize borders. So basically speaking, you really need to have that type of cooperation. And we were taught some valuable lessons in terms of appreciating our healthcare workers. I think that was something I think very positive which came out of it. We've learned to use technology in a way we didn't before. We now have people working from home, which none of these things I think would have accelerated like they did unless we had the pandemic. So are we able to move forward and learn from all of this and create a more resilient and responsive healthcare system and be prepared for the next pandemic, because I'm sure we will have one?
No, I'm sure we will have one, and it's good to be reminded of some of those aspects, Patrick. That I wonder, when we talk about the value of health workers, though people came out clapping, there was enormous disappointment when, certainly in the UK, there was no substantial pay increase or real recognition, material recognition of what the health workers had done. So a lot of people who were nurses through that time left the health service. So it's been a very mixed picture in terms of whether what you say, which I would love to believe was true, is of the value that we give to not only health workers but workers on the front line. I think what did happen is a revaluation of who matters in a moment of crisis or emergency. And that was quite striking. It wasn't necessarily the people who earned most incomes, but the emergency workers who we relied upon, transport workers, supermarket workers, often low paid workers relatively in terms of a capitalist economy. They were the people who we were mostly dependent upon. So that raised quite fundamental questions about value. Who do we value? And why did it take so long, or take a pandemic, to value health workers? And then what's the relationship of value to people's material rewards? And I think that question it raises a really, and then what does it mean about the economies that we live in, such that we wake up to the sense that the people we're most dependent upon are those people who couldn't do work from home. Certain kind of professions and workers, including me, I could work from home. But those people who could work from home were the ones that we were most dependent upon in situations like, who were the least paid in the capitalist economy. So I think that's a striking. I think the question of value is really, really important. And I agree that certain levels of cooperation were learned. They're really important at a transnational level. But Michael also reminded us that 30% of the population never got. So there's a certain level of cooperation between certain states, mainly in the global north, China and India. But there are other countries where, if you look at it like I looked in Brazil, who got the vaccine and who didn't get the vaccine in Brazil is a real interesting thing, and how it spread, and how the government in Brazil said things like, if you take the vaccine, then you're going to look like a horse or something. It was, the level of Bolsonaro's attack on the vaccine. So I think the question of trust and value is emerging this evening as a really, really important to think about, and then to think about whether we are. So my question to you, Patrick, is why does it take, I thought it took a really long time in Britain to get an inquiry. Why has it taken so long in Ireland?
I'd love to be able to answer that, Vic. I've no idea. Maybe we're just waiting to see how the others go and see how best we can handle it. I've no idea.
Because it's like 4 years, isn't it? And Ireland did.
It is, yes.
Better than the UK, didn't it?
Yes. Yes.
So it's interesting why it isn't there, or why it's taken so long. Because I thought it was inordinately long in Britain before the thing got going.
I don't think we had
it was very clear that it was the bereaved parents who were really leading the inquiry. So it'd be interesting whether that's happening in Ireland as well.
I think we didn't have as much Partygate to deal with, so maybe a factor. We've had possibly a bit more trust in some elements of it. To some degree, perhaps, Vic, but that's maybe another conversation. We are well over the normal time. which is great. It's been very engaging. I'm conscious that there are other people here, and if I may, Vic, just to be cordial and polite in the sense of how we've been all of this evening. Is there anybody else who would like to comment or I've seen a thank you from Vic in our message chat. Just for everybody to know, I've put a link in the meeting chat, which is a direct link to Vic's book and a kind discount. So if you take a moment, I'll give you all a moment. If you open the meeting chat, you will see I have created a link, and you should be able to copy that quite easily and then bring it to your Google search or whatever search portal you have, and use that link and paste it, and you will be directly brought to the book for a 50% discount. And if there's any problems with that, you can contact our association, and I will send out. In fact, we will seek to put it on our social, our website, as as a general thank you. We also put the recording on our YouTube channel. But any issues with getting that link, if you could perhaps just give me a little thumbs up that you've got it and you've seen it, brilliant, and then everybody can use that as needed. Thank you, Vic, for inspiring talk, and thanks to HI for hosting. Thank you, Judith. So again, I'll just make sure anybody else. I see no hands going once, going twice, 3 times. So without further ado, the last thing we always like to do is to give the final word to our eminent speaker this evening. So Vic, your final word, please.
Well, it's just been it's been lovely both seeing people who are friends and meeting new friends and just talking like this, because it's exactly what I wanted to happen, which was an open conversation that Michael promised. And it's not just me speaking, it's that we've been able to identify certain issues for us all to think about. And what's emerged quite deeply is both the nature of science and scientific methodology in relation to, these are questions that I'm left with, the relationship of the science and scientific methodology, and the questions about facts and values, and the way that methodology allowed the medical people, senior medical people, as Rick framed, to submit to the politicians. And then questions of trust and how to think about trust in the context of democracy, and what can we learn from different countries and different experiences. But also, thirdly, the importance to remember, and that we all have work to do in our own communities about not forgetting and remembering in a way that means that we can support those people, including ourselves, who are still carrying. I'm very into the way that things get carried in bodies that we're often unaware of. We don't speak about them, particularly as men, we don't speak about them, because we've learned that emotions are a sign of weakness and a threat to our male identities. And because of that masculinity, we tend to silence ourselves and cut off the possibilities of learning from those very difficult kind of life experiences that we all live through.
Thank you, Vic. Thank you to Hugh, to Rick, to Judith. Sorry, I didn't get Judith's sister's name. Marie.
Marie.
Brilliant. And of course to Patrick. Great to see you on, and for everybody else who joined. I think we talked tonight about the inequalities and those who have struggled, the vulnerable. But if anything, tonight we see a little bit of empathy. We see a little bit more hopeful positivity, which proves that as humans we can, you know, come together, and even in virtual mode. And tonight didn't feel virtual; it felt very connected. So, on that note, thank you everybody, thank you to Vic, and have a restful, wonderful evening. And as I said, we'll seek to post this on YouTube. So if anybody else wants to see it and view it, you've all been stars this evening. So thank you, Paul. Thank you for your time, and I bid you all good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to see friends too.